Hi there, everyone. We're going to get going pretty shortly, so if I can ask you to take your seats, that would be great. Show of hands. Who has been at a COP? Or number one. Okay, so a number of you, I'd say about half the room. Who intends to go to COP28? Oh, good. A significant portion of the room. What we want to do is talk about some of the developments that came out of COP27 and look forward into COP28 and really start to draw the link between what's happening at the international level and what's going on at the domestic level. So, given the size of the room, instead of having this be a speak at you session, we would far prefer this to be a speak with you session. So I encourage you to get in there, ask questions, and we will take questions as we go along. So with that as background, I'm Lisa DeMarco, the CEO of Resilient LLP. My colleague Jonathan is in the room. And I'm here with Andre Templeman from Alpha Inception and with Robyn Camp from RTI. And so you're in very good hands in terms of what happened at COP27 and where we're going into COP28. We're going to start with Andre, who's going to give you some views. We hope to mix this up a little bit. So don't be afraid of challenging or having any questions that you think are controversial come to the forefront. That's exactly what we intend to do with this session. So over to Andre first, and then to Robyn.
I just got a couple slides just because it makes it easier to argue my points. Not joking. And it's Andre Templeman, but I do know Templeton the Rat, so... but slightly different.
My apologies, Andre.
No. It happens every day. So it's not a big deal. There we go. Okay, so these are, I got a loud enough voice, you guys will all hear me. These are sort of my observations after watching a whole bunch of video, reading every article I could find, and paying a lot of attention both during COP26, 27, and thinking about what's coming up in COP28. I think the key successes that came out of COP27, and one of them was sort of seen as a surprise. If you read some of the background behind it, it was sort of seen as the EU sort of upstaging some of the other developed countries who have for years sort of pushed back against this loss and damage fund because they've really been afraid of sort of taking legal liability for all the damage that's been done to the world. And so the Americans and a lot of countries sort of fought against that. The Europeans sort of teamed up with a lot of the developed world who was saying, look, we don't want to agree to anything unless you get this thing across the board. So I think that was seen as a victory for a lot of the developing world. There's not a lot of details. We'll talk about that as one of the failures potentially so far. But I think that was a key success just to get it on the table and being talked about for the first time, really, in terms of numbers. There was an actual really interesting group run by a fellow Canadian, which I liked, and this goes into a lot of stuff that's been come up this last year. The idea that greenwashing, the companies sort of decarbonize food, but also how it can help sequester carbon. And I think that's a big movement that we're starting to see, especially in California, as you guys have seen in the last scoping plan. I think internationally as well, it's very important. I mean, food, to some extent, is responsible for about a third of global emissions. And if we're going to solve the solutions that we're going to get to, it really has to deal with both, the emissions and how we sequester, using, and still be able to feed everybody on the planet. And I think that's kind of a key thing. Let's go to the next slide. And if anybody's got any questions, jump in or put your hand up.
We've got one here. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Just a quick question on the McKenna report. I actually read that report. It's a list of thou shalt nots.
Yeah.
And then it asks for the global energy companies to commit unilateral suicide.
True.
And then, interestingly, if you look at who wrote it, it's about 40 people on the panel, on a group of experts. Between all of them, you can get together one career that's not in advisory or academia, like one actual corporate.
Somebody who's actually got a corporate position?
Yeah. There's about 5 McKinsey careers if you add them together, none in total. We need experts from academia, we need all these people, but have you seen any involvement in this for people who actually will have to implement and have a plan and know how business works as opposed to throw rocks?
Yeah, and I think all of these things have to develop that way, which is why I think, look, the reason I got into environmental markets, I came from the commodity markets, electricity, natural gas, because when I got into this, say, 15 years ago, a lot of people were sort of green wishing, which is what I used to call it, and they'd be like, yeah, we want to do this, we want to do that, and I'd be like, well, what are the economic advantages of this? Like, you can't make it make sense to the bottom line to companies. You can't just ask them to shut down, right? Some company that's got 50,000 employees, you can't say, hey, we want you to shut down next week. You got to give them a pathway to actually do something. So I completely agree. I think one of the things that you're hopefully seeing is that it moves from the academics and maybe the more policymakers to the implementation stage when you get a lot more businesses involved. At least that's my hope.
Andre, if I can just jump in for a second.
Sure.
A lot of criticism about the high-level expert groups' work, particularly the statements following the high-level expert groups' work, which can be interpreted to be in contravention of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. They specifically don't allow for the use of offsets to meet those targets. It's one of the 10 recommendations, and as you'll well know, Paris Article 6 is a markets provision that allows for offsets and other market mechanisms to meet the Paris targets. So it's a good and sage comment, and it's something to be cognizant of as we go forward, assessing things like Race to Zero and the GFAN's, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero developments, as well as the pronouncements of the high-level expert group.
And I'll bring up on another slide. I mean, look, one of the, not dirty secrets, but I mean, one of the parts of this is all going to be very, very expensive, right? You can hope that it ends up being cheaper if we use markets, but none of this is going to be cheap. And I think that's a key point. So, I'll give you an example. And I'll talk about it on one of the other slides, but the loan loss provisions, I mean, basically, even though it was set up, there was really little details on how much, who's going to pay, and who's going to receive it. In fact, there was a whole bunch of articles I got right after the thing came out that said the United States could end up paying China, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure everybody saw those articles, but they were like, China's going to be a receiver, and the United States is going to be a payer, and if we do that, forget it, for revolution. So, obviously, things like that, you can't take the second richest country in the world and say that they're going to receive a huge bunch of funds, potentially. So there's a lot to be determined here. To date, only $340 million has been put to this. Now that's, I'll show you the next slide, but that's compared to anywhere between $200 to $300 billion a year, which is required for this fund. So far we've got, I don't even know if it's a drop in the bucket, but we've got like the start of a drop. There was no agreement on phasing out coal and other fossil fuels. Now, I don't think, to your point, I don't think you want to self-suicide huge parts of the industry, right? And even if you look at the Biden administration that's opening up drilling in Alaska, at the end of the day, you've got to sort of live while you're changing your world. I'm not a big fan of a complete phase out, but I do think
you just speak up a little bit?
Sorry, taking slight umbrage with the final point and taking Lisa's invitation provides some challenge. As the UK's artificial negotiator in recent years, so I've been myself. And I actually found that there was quite a lot of progress after COP27. 6.2 was largely operational. There's some stuff in 6.4, like the application of software energy to underwrite credits and stuff like that. But I think it's quite interesting your point, because I think there's a problem communicating the progress.
Yeah.
Actually, it continues to be a very big problem in the see. So I think there's something to show in what the saying case is for many there wasn't much progress and they failed this kind of implementation. Whereas for a lot of negotiators, they might have felt that there's a lot more progress than that. And that's what it suggests. So it's quite an interesting point.
Right, and Rome wasn't built in a day. I mean, there was some progress made. I think, like people like myself who trade in markets, we like to see very concrete, specific rules, so we can say, go to a lawyer and say, okay, I did this, I transacted this, I bought that, I own that, and that sort of stuff was getting there, but not there yet. And, I mean, look, my recommendation to all of my clients this last year has been stay out of the international stuff until some of these rules get set up, because I'm like, look, you might buy something that you think you own, and the country might come back and say, we own it. Or we own 30% of it, or 35% of it, or whatever. And if you put private capital in, those investors are never going to give you money again. So I kind of said, look, wait. And I think a lot of people that I've talked to have said they've been waiting. And so at this point, I kind of see Article 6 needs to get fleshed out as soon as possible, because there is investment dollars that are probably on the sidelines as a result of rules not being very specific, so that people know where the property rights are, who has them, what counts, what doesn't count, what's minusing, what's plusing. And I just think there's not enough, probably communication, but there's also not enough specific contractual details. That's my
Andre, if I can just jump in on that briefly, and bearing a similar perspective, sitting at the negotiating table with you and yours from a different country, what wasn't decided in Glasgow. So prohibitions on international transfers of non-authorized 6.2 and 6.4. We all kind of thought that was decided, but this year we found out there's not an express prohibition. So we have this new category of mitigation compatible or mitigation contribution emission reductions, which has danger associated with it, the danger of creating a parallel market. What also wasn't decided? The rules of the supervisory body. We didn't make a bunch of progress there either, and what else wasn't decided? Whether 6.4 can include emission avoidance or conservation enhancement. We didn't decide that this year. What else wasn't decided? The operation of the mechanism of the registry, connection to the international registry, the interoperability. We do have a 2-year work program. We got that, but what we, as people who sit around the negotiating table, should be hearing loud and clear is IPCC just told us we have a 7-year window. More, faster. 2-year work plans don't fly. And I know you internalize that in the same way we do. And the markets negotiations this year were a little bit frustrating, actually, if I can say that quietly, without attribution. And in particular, I have great concerns around the inter alia language in the 6.4 decision that would allow for this potential parallel sovereign credit market to develop.
Yes, that seems really. I don't want to have another discussion too much longer, but that was one of the big things talked about Paris years ago. But so much of the ambiguity lie behind, I think, what people are inferring from the text itself rather than a strict observation of the negotiations. So the inter alia language, in my view, I was involved in the drafting of the mitigation contribution stuff, is often
Well,
One question I have for the lawyers in the room is, let's say you enter into one of these transactions. Where's your venue if you have an issue? Is it the UN? Is it that each individual state just follow what rules? You know, I mean, I don't know. Like when I spend money, or when I tell my investors to spend money, I want to know that there's somewhere I can go and say, look, I've got a piece of paper that means something.
well, we have that for 6.4, right? We did get an appellate body in the rules of 6.4 coming out of.
That's a question I wrote.
Yeah. Coming out of Glasgow, that came out, not out of Sharm, but we definitely have that in the Glasgow rules, and I think there's good precedent. Yes, in relation to that. And then also all of the international dispute settlement bodies, like UNCITRAL is convening a forum to refine its rules for carbon-related disputes, and similarly ICSID, the investor state, under the World Bank Group forum, is currently involved in dispute resolution on specific carbon transactions. So I think there's a lot there, but can we put a placeholder on this about what to look for on COP28? And I'm very cognizant to make sure Robyn jumps in here, and then I know we've got a question there. Is that Andre, is that a good time?
Yeah, well, I'll just sit down for a minute, and why don't you jump into what's going on, and then I'll deal with a couple of those slides at the end.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, Robyn Camp and I come to NACW as somebody who grew up coming to NACW and then has been out of this part of the game for a while, and so it's fun to come back. I see some old friends in the room, and I wear a different hat these days. So I actually work for a research institute, RTI International, and in addition to doing things like parts of the U.S. National Inventory and helping NASA evaluate the effectiveness of early warning systems, RTI International implements U.S. foreign assistance programs in 90 countries. And this is in the health sector, in the energy sector, in the environment sector, mangroves, land protection and conservation. And so and we participate in the COP as an observer. And so from this kind of neutral, technical, people who collect data and then help partners implement solutions that are going to increase their resilience, diminish the negative effects of climate change, there's recognition that the market is a tool that can help to connect the dots and make these things possible. So when I think about the COP and I think about successes at COP27 and what I'm looking for at COP28, it's really about how does the work that we're doing, how does it translate, how does it benefit the lives and the communities that are most affected, most vulnerable to climate change. So, from a big picture perspective, appreciate there's new instruments taking place, that there's a lot of impetus, and that the markets, it's, COP27, I heard for the first time that John Kerry is looking to the voluntary market as a potential tool to scale up and accelerate the pace that money can get to communities. And I was interested in the panel earlier to think about how carbon markets can show up and can provide economic development for communities. Appreciate the creativity. For the first time at COP28, there's a call for reforming the World Bank and the IMF, and using their capital in a creative way, because we're not on track. We're not on track to deliver and mobilize the trillions of dollars that are invested that are needed to address the problems. Was also excited coming out of COP27 to see the level of engagement of the private sector to increase. And I think it's really this appreciation that the UN is this, slow-moving, consensus-driven body that just necessarily moves at a very slow pace, and look into other ways to accelerate progress. And so excited at some of the initiatives that make it possible and really critically involve the private sector, whether it's looking at protecting forests, whether it's a global methane pledge, whether it's foundations showing up with billions of dollars of investment to help accelerate clean energy. So I'm, thinking about COP27, taking a step back, recognizing, as Lisa said, takeaways from COP27 are that we're making progress. It's not fast enough. The science tells us we're not on track. Being creative and looking for solutions, recognizing that the private sector absolutely has to be part of that, and looking at trying to think of new ways to use the resources that we have, whether it's the markets, whether it's the multilateral development banks. I will also say one other thing from COP27 that I was pleased to see was the U.S. back at the table in a meaningful way. As an American, right, it was gratifying to think we can be part of the solution again. And as a taxpayer, I recognize that means opening the U.S. pocketbook, in a meaningful way. And let's see how that plays out.
Do you want to jump back in, Andre, on?
Sure. Let me just go to, so let's put this on, because I think this kind of goes to what you're talking about. And this, Craig brought this up this morning. I mean, the issue is, and you can see kind of here, I don't know if this has a pointer on it, but anyways, the top is where we're at. The two bottoms are where we want to be. And essentially the answer is we're nowhere near what we need to do. And I think one of the things that's coming out in all these COP discussions is really we need to get way more capital, way more people involved, way more companies, way more new technologies. California, I think, if you look at where California is, California prides itself on being sort of bleeding edge of environmental issues. The reality is California is only getting to the point where our targets right now are basically just to about 2 degrees if the entire world adopted. So even we are not where we need to be yet. And we're at the bleeding edge. So if you think of every other state and every other union that's not at the bleeding edge, how much do we have to do? And the answer is huge. Huge heavy lifting. And I think the point there is how do you get it from discussions to your point, how do we get private capital, private companies to all make a difference, right? Because this will never get solved by a bunch of discussions. It really won't. I mean, it helps start things, but if we're going to get to these targets, I mean, I kind of look at it now, and Craig's comment, I think, was very relevant this morning. Is 1.5 off the table? I kind of think at the end of the day it is. I mean, we're all aiming there still, but you look at these targets and you kind of say, okay, we're aiming for 2 now? Or 2.5? Or 3? And one of the things that scares the crap out of me is just an individual. And every time I talk to my kids, is there's all these tipping points that we're aware of, right? You know that methane's going to get released from, up north if you get above a certain temperature. The ice caps, you've got all these things that once they happen, we get to a point where we're going to get to the point that no matter what we do, those things are going to happen in 10 years. Right? And I think that's the concern that keeps me up at night. I was going to make a comment, kind of a joke, but I've been coming to these things for about 20 years. I've also been trying to lose weight for about 20 years. And let's be real. Next year, I'm probably going to be here, and I probably won't have lost very much weight. But I kind of hope that next year we can get here, and that for once, it seems like we're not always saying, hey, the earth is on fire. Like, I want to be able to come to my kids and say, look, we've actually got a plan that's going to get us there. And it seemed for the last 20 years that it's always 2 or 3 years out, and that bothers me. Let me do one last slide, and then I'll just sit down. That just says we're screwed. Lots of it. But here's why I want to kind of bring up, and to your point, opening up the wallet, right? I hope we can. This gives you, I just tried to put sort of a proxy on what this is going to cost. So let's say that it's going to cost 250 to 500 billion is the estimate. On an annual basis is the investment that's going to be needed to deal with climate mitigation and adaptation between now and 2050. So that's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Here's some of the ways you can pay for it. I just got to put it down. I said, look, you got 1.2 billion people living in the developed world. You got 300 million in the rest of the world that are considered So that would equate to a $200 tax per person per year. I mean, it's not horrible, probably doable. It's big. You definitely get pushback from Republicans and from lots of people. And then lastly, I went, well, what if you do a millionaire tax? So 70 million millionaires in the world. If you pay for it that way, it would be $4,000 a year for each millionaire to contribute in basic funds. I mean, maybe. So my only point was here, it probably is payable, but we got to start raising the money and start getting that investment in there soon. And it's going to have to come with institutional money. But these are billions and billions, trillions and trillions of dollars that have to be invested, or you're just not going to get there. My last point on California, and then I'm going to sit down and sort of answer from over there, is what do we need to do in California? I think we need to continue to overachieve, because the rest of the world is underachieving. So we've got to pull our weight and do more. I think we have to look outwards, not inwards. The legislature in California always has this sort of like, well, let's just make sure our borders are connected. Let's make sure the offsets are all in state, and let's make sure everything's done here. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But if you don't pull in other jurisdictions and allow them to participate in this, probably the premier market in North America, you're not going to get there. And then my other point was, look, California's great at bringing out new technologies. We should really focus on the technology fund and say, look, these are the technologies we need to see develop worldwide. Can California lead in these technologies? Fund them, fund pilot projects, fund different things, prove them out here, and then export the technologies. We've always focused on exporting our systems and our trade program. I think California is a leader in technology. Let's become a leader in exporting the technology we can get there. So those are my points, but we'll keep answering the questions.
We'll go to a couple questions, but if I can just chime in on the inside, outside the COP points. So very briefly, 6 and 5. 6 main developments inside the COP. Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, which really touches upon the cover decision on the Glasgow Climate Pact and talks about the converging crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. Loss and damage, Andre spoke to, as did Robyn. Article 6, we did get some additional guidance on the technical aspects and future work. We got a global goal for adaptation, a work program to be finalized over the next year. We got new quantified goal on finance, a 2024 deadline, finally. And we got a mitigation work program to be finalized in 2026. Too little, too late. So a note. Outside the COP, i.e. around the COP, particularly for those of you that are Americans in the room, a lot happened. The U.S. Energy Transition Accelerator. This is John Kerry's initiative, Market's initiative, which is developing a program to facilitate effectively a jurisdictional and nested program for energy, renewable energy, to decarbonize energy in countries around the world. This could be a fantastic technology export credit accelerator if the U.S., particularly California and others, get on it. The Indonesia G7 Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, U.S., Japan, other partners, $20 billion mobilized to decarbonize Indonesia power sector. Renewables, phase out of unabated coal. Vietnam, South Africa also involved that. Big. The African Carbon Market Initiative, $300 million of carbon credits annually by 2030, $1.5 billion by 2050, and it includes advanced market commitment led by an exchange trading group, Nando's and Standard Charter. I would have never put Nando's Food, an exchange trading group, and Standard Charter in the same group before. This is a positive outcome of the COP. Yeah, spicy sauce is right, secret sauce. The basic ministerial joint statement supporting Article 6, historically you would not have seen Brazil, South Africa, India supporting markets to the same extent that's entrenched in this statement. And then the Canada-Chile Global Carbon Pricing Initiative, real push to get from 20% of the world covered by carbon pricing to 60% of the world covered by carbon pricing by 2030. So these are not insignificant deals, and they're concrete, they're market-based, they're now, and the U.S. has a very substantive involvement in all of the same. So there was a question here. There were 2 questions here. Let's start here, and then we'll go to the center of the room next. I'll go to the center of the room. There you go.
Let me add one comment, which is I like this inside, outside the COP. I would also add, outside the COP, there was an unprecedented level of participation, right? It was the biggest COP ever. 50,000 people showed up. Now, do they all need to be there? Maybe not. But, that was unprecedented. And what I think was different, too, is it was a more diverse and broad set of participants than ever before. And that changed the conversation, I think, that happened inside the COP. And then I'll just add also, all of that energy, we've talked about this, but there was also a sense of urgency that I have never witnessed before at a COP. And I think that also colored the conversation.
Perfect. Yeah. So, question here.
Thanks. Michael Green, worked for a company called Native out of Burlington, Vermont, project developer with a portfolio spread across the globe. I've been to most of the COPs and intersectionals for the last 9 years or so. And last year at the intersectionals, I took the time to sit down with some of our host countries and talk to them about just kind of temperature check their basic understanding of what's happening within the voluntary market within their own country. And it was actually startling to hear the lack of understanding, knowledge for how project pipelines work, what the investment opportunity. And these are countries that have hundreds of projects registered on the voluntary market in their country. So gearing up, looking at bond here before we even get to COP, I'm kind of curious, what's the role that actors such as ourselves in the voluntary market can play in actually bringing that knowledge gap along with the actual negotiating parties and with some of our host countries, and if you see that as a fruitful, helpful conversation to be had, or other resources you might recommend, especially from folks who sit on some of those negotiating bodies, would be really helpful to hear your advice.
I would point to definitely activity through the bingos and ringos in the short term. And then in Bonn itself, there are going to be a number of discussions around key elements, one of them being removals. So if you can contribute to the removals discussion, there is a facilitated session that's going on at the intersessional. And there's call for input. Where's Jonathan? Jonathan, is it March 31st or March 31st is a deadline for input through the processes in and around the subsidiary body and the 6.2 decisions. There are specific calls for public participation and input on some of those decisions. So I'd really encourage you to make your voice heard through those official processes. They get read. They're important. They become part of the record. Very, very important. But other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually my work, my organization's work, is we are agents of technical assistance, for donors around the world, and we're in the trenches. And I can say, every country we work in, the number one challenge is having projects that are ready for investment, and so my organization, our work is very much like building that capacity, helping to navigate the conditions. And so it is, to me, it's a systemic issue and a systemic question. We've got the need. We know it's not moving fast enough. There are efforts to try and help make things move faster, but it comes down to just very practical. And I'd love to talk with you afterwards, very practically, how do we do it? Because if it comes down, we spend a lot of time. Taking a step back, we spend a lot of time negotiating fine points because we see that the markets have the potential to move trillions of dollars of capital, but it breaks down at the point where you can't get the project ready to get the capital, even though it's a good project. It breaks down at the point of do you know how to do a business plan? Do you know how to sit down with a lender? So I would say organizations like Native Energy, I hope you're growing. I hope you're scaling. I'd love to know. Let's talk. Let's see how we can work together to build your capacity, because I see your role as really critical in connecting that market to the work on the ground.
I'll make more local pitch here. Give you an example. Even in California, policymakers don't understand these markets, right? So California, which is bleeding edge, you walk into the average legislator's office and ask them what an offset is, and most of them hate them or haven't read them or read some report by Danny or whatever and don't know what they're dealing with. So I think the one thing we can do is in every jurisdiction you go to, you should stop into the local, legislature, stop into the local government, talk to cities, states, national. Every one of you that's in a state that doesn't have a cap and trade program or doesn't have an active offset program. I live in Utah. I'm trying to talk to some very redneck, clearly opposed, don't even believe that there's climate change still people, but I go and, once a month I try and talk to somebody at the legislature. It's all incremental steps, right? Because some of these people, even in very forward-looking places, don't get this stuff. And if you don't get them understanding why we're doing this, at some point it could come back and bite you in the ass. And I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on YouTube, but talk to all your jurisdictions. Sell yourselves, because what we're trying to do is actually good. And to somebody's point today, stop when people come and start to pitch the negative story. You got to say, no. Here's all the good stories. Don't pick the one out of 100 that you didn't like.
I also think we need some teenagers who are really good at TikTok to help tell the story and just make it more accessible. So if you know any, please send them my way.
I misspoke. I said March 31st. Those submissions were actually, there's 2 rounds of them, the operation of the mechanism registry and the connection to the international registry. They were due on March 15th, but the point is still there. And then secondly, the submissions on removals based on the supervisory body decision on the 6th of November were also due on March 15th, not the 31st. But the point is every person active in this market should be putting forward submissions to help shape it.
Yeah.
And we're not. We're letting too few voices have
Control.
too disproportionate of an impact on that. So there's a question here, a question there, and the question here.
Yeah, so with regard to tipping points, okay, talk louder. So with regard to tipping points and how to avoid the worst ones, and then also how to fund that, right? As an example, I think that we need to get really creative with finance and through the lens of disaster, maybe. So for example, we have about 200 million acres in the U.S. that is at risk of high severity fire. And every year we break the next year's record, and every year we spend more and more money suppressing that fire and creating the problem. We could take an ounce of prevention approach and get some of that fuel out of the forest, and do you know what that would do? That would decrease our suppression budget. We can take, we have these technologies that we're talking about, we can take that carbon and create biochar that the soils, and now those forests are more resilient. We are protecting our, basically, sinks in our forests, and we're also protecting them from drought-induced mortality. And to get to the, token redneck here, group in the forestry towns, we can actually show communities that we are creating resilience in their communities, that we are protecting them from fire, from drought, and all of that. So how do we get more creative about not doing emergency expenditures that come with for that ounce of prevention? How do we get there, and how can that actually help us address this really large price tag on what it's going to take to get there?
I have a quick suggestion for you. I think the insurance sector is hugely important in doing precisely what you're talking about. And they've made specific commitments under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for net zero. There's a specific net zero insurance agency alliance. I've got the acronym slightly wrong there, but they need policy assistance, work, initiatives, creativity, and they are all over the preventative investment as opposed to the reactive investment. Other thoughts?
No, I agree.
I think it's like connecting the dots. It's like the government, I think, has a role in terms of setting policies and plans and creating good guidance and making it possible. Like we're here. This is the North American Carbon World Conference. Like, so we're talking about that. We see what an issue is, and consider it exponentially in every country in the world. Like, what is it? And to me, like not the easiest way, but you centralize it and bring it back to the government. If there is a good model, a good framework, that's a good starting point.
And I liked your point on TikTok, but I mean, look at people like Greta, right? Get your kids involved. Like, every time when I talk to my kids about what I do, I tell them what's going on, and sometimes they go, "Dad, that's horrible." But I'd rather tell my kids who are 12 and 14 that this is what's happening to their world so that they get involved now. And I've done presentations in front of my kids' schools, and look, you want to get what other Gretas are out there who are going to affect millions of people's opinions? So it can't just be us old people, and I'm just referring to myself, but we need to get the 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds to bug their grandparents, you got to get those people who are going to pull on the emotional triggers, because that's my opinion.
Can I stir that up a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
So I fully appreciate the kids' perspective. My kids who are in their 20s will say, "Mom, you've been at the UN negotiations for 20 years. You're complicit. You're complicit in this problem." I think we run such a risk of letting perfection be the enemy of the good. The worst course of action is no action.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have an imperfect protocol, system, something, and have action being undertaken than having a constant barrage of criticism because this is not perfect. And I think we have to start getting messy with that.
When you talk to young people in college, and I try to, in their 20s or my kids or whatever, their biggest criticism is, well, it's so depressing, I don't want to get involved. And you have to tell them, no, get involved. Put TikTok, put Instagram, like all the crap that everybody in the young age does. At the end of the day, that does set social policy. And if they're voters, get them out to vote, right? I mean, the worst thing we can have in 2 years is an administration that pulls the U.S. back from everything we've done. I would hate that on a global scale.
Why don't we take these two questions and then we'll answer both simultaneously? Do you want to start, Keegan?
We've outlined sort of a discussion, and I know it's hard to hear back there. So a discussion where there's an international process that is devolving towards government power as the key stakeholder. There's a call for private sector actors to engage with all of those people, and there's no linkage between those two.
Yeah.
So the UN process says, we're going to have Article 6, we're going to have markets, we're going to do funds, we're going to mitigate, and then the private sector is going to do it. And then the private sector doesn't have time to comment on everything and read everything and stay up to speed on all of the activities. So you suggested we go to the bingos and the ringos, but they're going to set up policy comments and participation that isn't going to mobilize private money. How do we get the two actors setting policy to communicate much more effectively? Because right now they don't. And I think that's a huge, like we have these aspirations that private business isn't really going to jump in because there's no rules.
So private-public communication and mobilization of funds. And the next question is?
Oh, yeah.
I spoke to a senior partner of a large accounting firm who remained anonymous, who was intimately involved. And he's sitting there laughing at the idea that I want to trade voluntary carbon credits because he says, pretty soon when we have this locked up, if you want it out of Indonesia, they're going to have to agree to let it go. John Kerry's going to have to agree to let it arrive in the United States.
Yep.
Or you white boy traders should just go away. This is government versus government. We're going to get this done at some point. P.S. There are only 3 net negative carbon countries under there in these than somebody else. So basically, if anybody wants to buy a carbon credit, you basically have to buy it from them. By the way, that consulting firm works with Guy on it and figure out who it is. But I sometimes get the feeling that the people at the top negotiating this kind of don't want the voluntary market that we all know should work. Is that a valid thought or not?
I would say there is a complexity of views around the table about what working is. And it's not surprising that you'd see a difference in view between G77, G7 or G20, between the African group and the environmental integrity group, between the like-minded developing countries group and the umbrella group. It's not surprising that you're going to see different perspectives at the table. And in fact, that's the beauty and the strength of the UN process. When you can get 195 countries with completely disparate worldviews to get around the table and agree on something, absolutely. To the point of whether or not capital meshes and you're going to get a vibrant market, money talks very loudly. We are seeing mobilization of capital in a way that we haven't seen for ages.
I agree.
Ages. Number one. Number two, in terms of the rules to get there, if anybody tells you that the voluntary market is not part of the pathway and doesn't, in fact, converge in certain points with the compliance markets under Paris Agreement, they haven't read the agreements. They're both important. The authorized for use portion of Article 6 is where you can see voluntary markets evolve or converge with compliance markets under Paris, and they're incredibly important.
There's a question.
I would also say there's a new, I think, appreciation that what is needed ultimately is a mosaic of solutions. And this term is being used specifically related like to the loss and damage, the issue of loss and damage. But I think it applies to the bigger issue. Like, we're trying to tackle this problem. We know it costs trillions of dollars. There's not one way that's going to get there. So my perspective is, if it works and it's delivering the environmental and community benefit and the equity goals of the climate change treaty, if it works, it's going to keep working, and that there's power in like something that works well. So, if you build it and it works, maybe it will keep going.
The one thing I will say as well on that is that I think there's a view out there, and I've had these discussions with people like Kip Lipper and others who, are policymakers in California and don't like markets. And you ask them why, and they're like, well, because they didn't work with Enron and they didn't work with so-and-so. And I'm like, yeah, but look, at the end of the day, it's all money. And you have to create, if it's not money involved, you're not going to get the private sector in. I think one of the things I've seen from corporate clients is that the people who got involved earlier start to realize they can make money off this, they can get more efficient, they can reduce their carbon footprint, but they can also reduce their energy costs. And as people do that, they realize that there's all these unanticipated benefits from being forward-looking. The other comment that I hear a lot is, look, we want to see highest carbon price possible so that we get this big signal. And I'm like, yeah, but there's only a certain amount of money to be spent on this. So when there's low prices, if I can do 3 times as much removal because the markets are efficient and they work well and they reduce prices, that's not a bad thing, right? Like, I've had many, if you look at LCFS, we're delivering way more emission reductions than LCFS ever promised. So people look at it and they're like, well, it's $60, it's failing. I'm actually looking at it going, you know what? It succeeded beyond imagination because it's so oversupplied, because we succeeded way beyond. 10 years ago, the oil guys were like, you're never going to get there, and it's going to be $300 billion, and you're never going to be there. The reality is we delivered it, and now prices are $60 because there's way too much supply. I'd much rather have that problem in these carbon markets, that we're doing things at lower costs so that we can do 3 times as much carbon removal than have it be so high priced that people freak out at the social cost of doing this. This is my view, but
I have been a crappy moderator. Nico, will come to you. We had a list of 5 questions that I promised
we didn't
on
answer them?
destruction. We didn't, but I think this was a lot more fun. Am I forgiven?
I think so. It was good.
Okay.
Everybody
good, 'cause
okay with what we did?
I think it's much more practical to speak to the needs in the room, and we have time for maybe 1, maybe 2
I saw
different
one hand
questions.
over there.
Nico's there, and there's a question there.
Yeah, thank you. Nico Van Alphen, Czechoslovakia. I want to go back to what you put a pin in and been touched on by a couple of the folks here, and that's that inter-alia language, and then the previous comment about the conclusion, the interpretation that the Article 6 findings are essentially anti-VCM and not allowing for anything other than contributions that go to the embassy of that host country. I read the inter-alia language as enabling a truck, an electric powered truck, to drive through that for the voluntary market and essentially allow that voluntary market to continue to operate under that, those 2 key words. Am I misreading that? Is that a safe reading?
I have thoughts, you have thoughts. Why don't we both speak them, because you can see how 2 different negotiators might take that. Sure. You're going to have to speak up, sorry. So I'll have a slightly different view on that, which is probably very legalistic, with a disclaimer. We are lawyers. The words in Glasgow were towards a NDC, not another NDC, so arguably they enabled domestic work. Where I see very significant problems is in relation to, there was always an ability for a country to exempt an entity from authorization, so to have a voluntary market be active and contributing towards domestic action, that was there. Where I see a problem now with the inter alia language and how it's being used by a couple of key oil jurisdictions is that it doesn't require corresponding adjustments. So it allows for an accounting sleight of the hand that looks a lot like the challenges with the Red Dot Plus initiative in other jurisdictions. And I think there's not accounting integrity.
And if things like that happen,
in that.
You lose capital.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I find
People run
it very
away from that.
challenging from that perspective. There was, we're over time. I'm sorry, but do you want to jump in quickly and we can take it up offline afterwards? I'm so sorry about that. Thank you. You've been a fantastically interventionist and engaged crowd, and we've benefited from great audience participation and super, super panelists. Thank you, Robyn. Thank you, Andre. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to chatting more about this.